Welcome to Uncovered Biblical History and Traditions, the channel dedicated to lost stories of the biblical past. Discover stories of pre-Christian historical roots, biblical legends, lost church history, and forgotten historical characters of faith. It is very helpful if you hit the like, subscribe, and share. Help build my channel, and let's take a look together into these uncovered forgotten tales. Imagine this: a childless nomad, nearly 100 years old, stands under a star-filled Middle Eastern sky around 4,000 years ago. The creator of the universe has just made him promises so vast, so impossible, that they would require his descendants to become some of the most populous nations on earth. This isn't mythology or legend, this is the beginning of a documented covenant that scholars argue has literally reshaped world demographics, created royal dynasties, and continues to influence global politics today. Today, we're diving deep into one of history's most audacious promises, the Abrahamic Covenant. Our story begins with a man named Abram, later called Abraham, who received what biblical scholars consider the most comprehensive set of divine promises ever recorded in human history. But these weren't just spiritual platitudes, they were specific, measurable, and according to researchers, have been systematically fulfilled across millennia. The covenant didn't emerge all at once. Instead, it unfolded through a series of increasingly detailed revelations that would challenge everything we think we know about demographics, politics, and world history. Each promise built upon the previous ones, creating what amounts to a prophetic blueprint for global development. What makes this particularly fascinating is that these promises were made to a man who, despite his advanced age, had no children. Yet the commitments were so specific that their fulfillment would require nothing less than the creation of some of Earth's largest population groups and most powerful nations. The first major expansion of Abraham's covenant came when God instructed him to look in all four directions from where he stood. In that moment, according to Genesis chapter 13 verses 14 to 16, Abraham received a promise that would boggle the mind: "For all the land which you see I will give to you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your descendants also can be counted." Think about that metaphor for a moment. Dust of the earth. Not just a large family, not even a substantial tribe, but numbers comparable to particles of dust covering the planet. Scholars who take this literally argue that such a promise could only be fulfilled if Abraham's descendants eventually included some of the most heavily populated nations on earth. The covenant deepened dramatically in Genesis chapter 15, when God approached Abraham with both comfort and challenge. The divine declaration was profound: "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, your reward shall be very great." Here was a man who had received incredible promises about his future descendants, yet he remained childless. In a moment of raw honesty that reveals his humanity, Abraham essentially challenged God: "Behold, thou hast given me no offspring." He wondered aloud whether these promises might be fulfilled through an adopted heir rather than a biological child. God's response was both categorical and theatrical. He rejected the adoption option entirely, then brought Abraham outside under the night sky for one of history's most dramatic object lessons. "This man, an adopted heir, shall not be your heir, your own son shall be your heir." And he, God, brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven, and number the stars, if you are able to number them, so shall your descendants be." Two metaphors now: dust of the earth and stars of heaven. Both represent quantities that are, for practical purposes, uncountable. Demographic researchers who study this covenant argue that its literal fulfillment would require Abraham's descendants to develop into multiple nations, not just one large country, but several of the world's most populous societies. What's remarkable is Abraham's response. Despite having no children and being advanced in age, he believed. This faith in promises that extended far beyond his lifetime has been cited as one of the most extraordinary examples of long-term thinking in human history. But the covenant wasn't all promise and blessing. In one of the most sobering prophetic visions ever recorded, Abraham learned there would be a dark side to his descendants' role in divine history. During what's described as a horror of great darkness, Abraham received a chilling preview of his lineage's future. The prophecy was devastatingly specific. Know of a surety that your descendants will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be slaves there, and they will be oppressed for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation which they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. 400 years. To put that in perspective, that's longer than the entire history of the United States. Imagine being told that your descendants would suffer systematic oppression for longer than America has existed, spanning multiple centuries and countless generations. Yet even this dark prophecy contained promises, divine judgment on the oppressing nation and ultimate liberation accompanied by great wealth. Historical researchers point to the Israelite experience in Egypt as the primary fulfillment of this prophecy, centuries of slavery followed by a dramatic exodus where the former slaves departed with substantial Egyptian wealth after a series of devastating plagues struck their oppressors. Following the dark vision came another territorial promise that would make any modern geopolitical strategist take notice. God promised Abraham, "To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates." This wasn't just the land of Canaan anymore. This was an empire stretching from Egypt to Mesopotamia, encompassing what today includes Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and portions of Iraq and Egypt. This territory controlled major ancient trade routes and included some of the most fertile and strategic land in the ancient world. The covenant reached its climax when Abraham was 99 years old, an age when most people are thinking about their legacy, not their future. What happened next was described as an awesome series of blessings, received in a face-to-face encounter with the Creator of the universe. God began with a familiar theme: "I will make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly." Then Abram fell on his face, and God said to him. The phrase, "fell on his face," indicates the overwhelming nature of this divine encounter. But this time, God went further than ever before. He announced, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations, not one nation, not even a few large tribes, but a multitude of nations." The scope was staggering. To reflect this destiny, God changed the man's name from Abram to Abraham, explaining, "For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations." Note the tense, "I have made you," past tense, as if it were already accomplished, despite Abraham still having no children. The promises continued, "I will make you exceedingly fruitful. Will make nations of you, and kings shall come forth from you, multiple nations, royal dynasties, political power on a global scale, all from one childless nomad." Then came the eternal aspect. "Will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you." This wasn't just for Abraham's lifetime or even his children's generation, it was forever. What makes this covenant particularly fascinating to researchers is the perspective gap it reveals between divine and human thinking. God spoke of these promises as accomplished facts even when Abraham had no children. This illustrates what scholars call the eternal perspective. When you exist outside of time, future events are as certain as past ones. This creates what researchers term the perspective problem. Humans, with their limited lifespans, want immediate results. We think in terms of years or decades. But the Abrahamic Covenant operates on a scale of millennia. Abraham's extraordinary faith lay partly in his ability to think beyond his own lifetime and trust in promises that would take centuries to fulfill. Here's where the story gets really interesting for modern audiences. Covenant researchers argue that history has systematically validated these ancient promises. They point to evidence that Abraham's descendants have indeed become some of the major nations of the earth, that royal dynasties have emerged from his lineage, and that some of his offspring continue to occupy thrones in modern nations. The demographic argument is particularly compelling. For the dust of the earth and stars of heaven metaphors to be literally fulfilled, Abraham's descendants would need to include some of the most populous nations on the planet. Researchers argue that this is exactly what we see when we trace his lineage through history. The political promises have also seen remarkable fulfillment. Multiple royal dynasties have claimed descent from Abraham, and several continue to this day. The promise that kings shall come forth from you has been realized across different cultures and time periods. What makes the Abrahamic Covenant relevant today isn't just its historical claims, but its ongoing implications. The eternal nature of the territorial promises continues to influence land disputes and international relations. From a faith perspective, the covenant's historical track record provides what supporters see as compelling evidence for trusting future biblical promises. If God kept these specific, measurable commitments over millennia, it suggests reliability for other biblical predictions about the future. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Abrahamic Covenant is how a series of promises made to one childless nomad 4,000 years ago continue to shape world events today. The precision of its fulfillment, the scope of its promises, and the duration of its influence make it unique in human history. It challenges our assumptions about time, planning, and the relationship between faith and evidence. As we face our own global challenges and uncertainties, perhaps there's something to be learned from Abraham's example, the willingness to embrace promises that extend far beyond our own lifetimes, and the faith to believe that some commitments are reliable enough to stake everything on, even when their fulfillment seems impossible. The Abrahamic Covenant reminds us that sometimes the most important promises take millennia to fulfill, but when they do, they reshape the world. What if everything you thought you knew about one of history's most important promises was only half the story? What if scholars, theologians, and billions of believers have been missing a crucial piece of the puzzle for thousands of years? Today, we're diving into a theological mystery that challenges conventional wisdom and reveals how two distinct divine promises to one man would reshape the entire course of human history. This is the story of Abraham, but not the Abraham you think you know. This is the story of two covenants, two names, and two promises that most people have never heard of, despite the profound implications for Christianity, Judaism, and our understanding of biblical prophecy itself. Picture an elderly man, 90 years old, standing in the ancient Near East over 4,000 years ago. He's childless, despite decades of divine promises about descendants. His wife Sarah is well past childbearing age. By every human measure, hope should be dead. But then something extraordinary happens, not once, but twice. Most Bible readers know that God made a covenant with Abraham. What they don't realize is that this statement is both completely true and fundamentally incomplete. The reality is far more fascinating. God actually made two entirely separate covenants with the same individual. The first was made with a man named Abram, and the second was made with that same man after his name was changed to Abraham. This wasn't merely a paperwork update. The name change represented a complete transformation of the covenant relationship itself. Abram, meaning exalted father, became Abraham, meaning father of multitudes. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't just two versions of the same promise. They were two distinct covenants with different purposes, different timing, and different implications that would echo through all of human history. The first covenant came when Abram was exactly 90 years old. Picture the scene. An aged nomad receives a visitation from the Almighty God himself. The divine being doesn't just make a promise, he makes an unconditional guarantee that defies everything Abram can see with his natural eyes. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, God declared, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come out of you. But here's the crucial detail that most interpretations miss. God promised not one nation, not even several nations, but many nations, a large plurality that would span the globe. This promise included something revolutionary for its time, a royal lineage. Kings would emerge from Abraham's descendants, ruling over these multiple nations. Even Sarah, originally named Sarai, received a name change to princess, because as the divine logic explained, only a princess could be the mother of kings. But perhaps most remarkably, this first covenant was completely unconditional. Unlike later agreements that would depend on human obedience and faithfulness, this promise rested entirely on God's integrity. Regardless of the moral or spiritual condition of Abraham's descendants, regardless of their choices or failures, this covenant would be fulfilled because God had assumed complete responsibility for its success. This unconditional nature becomes crucial when we consider what happened centuries later. When Abraham's descendants did receive a conditional covenant, one that required their obedience, they broke it spectacularly. God himself declared, "They continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not." That agreement was annulled due to human failure. But the original Abrahamic covenant, It remained unshakable because it never depended on human performance in the first place. Here's where this story challenges thousands of years of theological interpretation. Most religious traditions teach that Abraham's descendants are primarily, or even exclusively, the Jewish people. But if God truly fulfilled his promise of many nations, then logic demands that other peoples around the world must also be able to claim, "We have Abraham as our father." This isn't a minor theological footnote, it's a complete reframing of how we understand biblical promises and their fulfillment. If Abraham truly became the father of many nations, then the covenant story is far more expansive and inclusive than traditional interpretations suggest. The second covenant came much later, under dramatically different circumstances. Abraham had finally received his promised son Isaac, the miraculous child born to him and Sarah in their old age. Isaac represented everything, the fulfillment of decades of waiting, the channel through which all future promises would flow. Then came the unthinkable divine command, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and offer him as a burnt offering." Abraham's response reveals the depth of his faith. He had witnessed God's creative power in producing Isaac from parents who were as good as dead. If God could create life from nothing, Abraham reasoned, surely God could restore life even after death. So with unwavering trust in divine resurrection power, Abraham prepared to sacrifice the very son through whom all promises were meant to be fulfilled. It was after this ultimate demonstration of faith, when Abraham proved willing to sacrifice everything, that God established the second covenant. This time, the promise came with a divine oath. "By myself have I sworn," God declared, indicating that this covenant was as unbreakable as God's own nature. This second covenant reiterated the many nations promise but added something entirely new. "In your seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed." This wasn't about military conquest or political dominance, this was about universal benefit flowing to every people group on earth through one specific descendant of Abraham. The circumstances surrounding this second covenant weren't just historical events, they were prophetic theater. Every detail of the Isaac narrative pointed forward to a greater fulfillment. Isaac was a son of promise, miraculously born to aged parents. He was Abraham's only son through Sarah. He was offered as a sacrifice and, symbolically, received back from the dead when God provided a substitute ram. Isaac went on to fulfill his destiny as the channel of blessing to future generations. This pattern would be repeated perfectly in another son of promise. Jesus, like Isaac, was miraculously conceived. He was the only son of his divine Father. He was actually sacrificed and literally raised from the dead. And through him, the promise of universal blessing to all nations found its ultimate fulfillment. The Apostle Paul, writing centuries later, recognized this connection with startling clarity. When discussing Abraham's covenant, Paul made a careful grammatical observation: God didn't promise blessings through Abraham's seeds, plural, but through his seed, singular. "And to thy seed, which is Christ," Paul explained. This is where the story becomes truly fascinating from a logical standpoint. These two covenants aren't independent promises, they're utterly interdependent. The validity of the Messianic covenant depends on the fulfillment of the many nations covenant, and vice versa. Think about it, if God failed to fulfill his promise of making Abraham the father of many nations, how could anyone trust his promise about the Messiah? Conversely, if the Messianic promise is true, if Jesus really is the promised seed, through whom all nations are blessed, then the many nations promise must also be true. Paul understood this logical necessity. He argued that the law, which came 430 years after Abraham's covenant, could not annul promises that God had already confirmed. If a later legal system couldn't void the messianic aspects of Abraham's covenant, then neither could it void the promise about multiple nations. Today, thousands of years later, we can observe something remarkable. The historical evidence supports both covenant promises simultaneously. The Messianic covenant has been fulfilled in Christ, whose influence has indeed brought blessing to every nation on earth. Christianity has spread to every continent, every culture, every people group. It's important to recognize that in God's covenant promise of multiple nations, it always included the role of the northern 10 tribes of Israel in their history of the world. What makes this story ultimately compelling isn't just its historical or theological implications, it's the character of the one who made these promises. Both Abrahamic covenants rest on what the ancient text calls two immutable things, God and his oath. Unlike human contracts that can be broken by either party, these covenants have no contracting party of the second part. They don't depend on human performance, understanding, or cooperation. They rest entirely on divine integrity. This means that whether people recognize these promises or not, whether they understand them or not, whether they accept them or not, the covenants remain in effect. They're working themselves out in human history regardless of human awareness or participation. The story of Abraham's two covenants isn't just ancient history, it's a living reality that continues to shape our world. It's a reminder that some promises are bigger than human understanding, some plans unfold across millennia, and some guarantees are backed by nothing less than divine integrity itself. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Abraham's story isn't what it tells us about the past, but what it reveals about the nature of promises that transcend time, circumstances, and human limitation. In a world where commitments are broken daily and trust seems increasingly fragile, these ancient covenants stand as monuments to the possibility of unshakable faithfulness. Imagine this: you're looking at a map of the world in Moses' time. Most of the continents are empty wilderness. The Americas, uncharted. Australia, unknown. Even much of Europe and Asia remain unexplored territories. Yet according to an ancient Hebrew text, every single island, every continent, every habitable piece of land on earth had already been divided up and assigned, not by human explorers or conquering armies, but by God himself, in a cosmic real estate transaction that would shape the destiny of nations for millennia. This isn't just ancient mythology. It's a theological argument that claims to explain why certain bloodlines received certain territories, why some nations prospered while others struggled, and why the most contested pieces of real estate in human history were allocated long before anyone even knew they existed. Welcome to one of the most fascinating and controversial interpretations of divine election ever written. This analysis that argues God's promises weren't just spiritual, but intensely practical, involving actual geography, actual nations, and actual bloodlines that can be traced through history. The story begins with Abraham, a nomadic shepherd who received what seemed like an impossible promise. God told this childless wanderer that his descendants would become not just one great nation, but many nations. At the time, Abraham didn't even have a single heir, let alone the foundation for a multinational empire. But here's where the analysis gets interesting. God truly intended to create multiple nations from Abraham's lineage, then basic logistics demanded something extraordinary. God would have to provide sufficient territory for each of these future nations to flourish. After all, it is absolutely impossible that flourishing nations shall exist without national homes. This leads to one of the most sweeping claims in biblical interpretation. Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8-9, which declares, "When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob is the lot of his inheritance." Think about the implications of this passage. It suggests that when God was dividing up the earth among all peoples, he was specifically counting how many descendants Abraham would eventually have, and he was setting boundaries accordingly. Every national border, every territorial limit, every geographical boundary was determined not by natural features or military conquest, but by divine mathematics, calculated according to how much space the children of Israel would eventually need. What makes this interpretation so compelling is its scope. This divine land distribution wasn't limited to the small corner of the Middle East that people knew about in Moses' time. Instead, in the mind of God, every island was set apart, and every continent divided. The scope of this cosmic real estate plan embraces within its sweep the entire inhabited and inhabitable portion of the Earth's surface. Imagine God as the ultimate urban planner, laying out not just cities or regions, but entire continents. Every nation that would ever exist, whether it existed in Moses' time or would emerge thousands of years later, had already received its allocated territory. This included every nation, tongue, and people among the sons of Adam, whether they were already in existence or among the forthcoming nations. But here's the fascinating twist: while God was generously providing territory for all these different peoples, he was simultaneously playing favorites. When setting territorial bounds for other nations, God specifically remembered Israel. Sometimes this meant restricting the boundaries of other nations to leave more room for Abraham's descendants. Other times it meant enlarging the divisions intended for Israel to accommodate what the text calls that immense multitude of people when they shall have fulfilled their appointed destiny of developing into many nations. The story takes a deeply human turn when it comes to Abraham's family dynamics. Abraham, now old and still waiting for the promised heir through his wife Sarah, had already fathered a son named Ishmael through Sarah's servant, Hagar. From Abraham's perspective, this seemed like the obvious solution. He had a son, surely this was how God intended to fulfill the promise. We see Abraham's emotional investment in this arrangement. When God finally revealed his plans, Abraham made an earnest plea, exclaiming, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before thee." It's a poignant moment, a father advocating for his firstborn son, hoping that his practical solution would align with God's eternal plan. God's response reveals both compassion and inflexibility. The divine response showed that the Lord was not indifferent to Abraham's earnest appeal, and God even promised to bless Ishmael. But on the crucial matter of covenant inheritance, God was absolutely unmovable. God's message to Abraham was crystal clear: "Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac, and I will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year." What emerges from this narrative is systematic exclusion. It wasn't enough for someone to be Abraham's descendant, they had to be the right kind of descendant, through the right lineage, in the right way. Ishmael was excluded despite being Abraham's biological son. Later, when Abraham remarried after Sarah's death, he had additional sons through his second wife, Keturah. These sons eventually became the fathers of the Medes, Midianites, and other significant nations. So we can no more reckon these nations as a part of the promised many, than we can those which were formed by the posterity of Ishmael and Esau. If all of Abraham's descendants could be counted among the covenant nations, our task would be an easy one and our story soon told. But the theological interpretation demands a much more restrictive reading. The covenant nations must come only from Abraham and Sarah through their only son Isaac, whose posterity alone can be called, as they are called, the children of the promise, in contradistinction to those who belong to the other families, and who are called the children of the flesh. Perhaps the most dramatic example of this divine selectivity comes with the next generation, Jacob and Esau, the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. Here, the author argues, we see divine election in its purest form, a choice made not just before the individuals proved themselves, but literally before they were born. We see in Paul's interpretation from Romans, when Rebekah also had conceived by one, even our father Isaac, for the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth, it was said unto her, the elder shall serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. This passage presents what might be the ultimate theological puzzle. How can divine love and hatred be assigned before birth, before any actions good or evil? Paul anticipates the obvious objection, what shall we say then? Is there unrighteousness with God? His emphatic response, God forbid. The Apostle Paul, writing to the Romans, makes a crucial distinction: neither, because they are the children of Abraham, are they all national children, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. This leads to a fascinating theological conclusion. According to this interpretation, the election of Jacob over Esau, and indeed all the selections and rejections in Abraham's family line, are purely racial and national, rather than individual and spiritual. One of these two nations which sprang from the same mother is the recipient of national promises, glories, honors, covenants, and service of which the other is not a partaker. What makes this interpretation particularly nuanced is its acknowledgement of moral complexity within the chosen lineage. The Abrahamic nations are not necessarily a race of saints. In fact, some of that nation have been, and others are now, just as wicked as that fallen son of the heavens would have them. This creates a paradox. The chosen lineage produces both the most wicked and the most righteous individuals, suggesting that divine election operates on a different principle than individual moral merit. This theological analysis raises profound questions that echo through history and into our contemporary world. If territorial boundaries were indeed set according to divine mathematics, what does that mean for modern geopolitics? If certain bloodlines carry specific covenant privileges regardless of individual character, how does that affect our understanding of justice and equality? This interpretation suggests that divine election operates on multiple levels simultaneously: individual, familial, tribal, and national, with different principles governing each level. The selection of Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, wasn't about personal salvation or individual righteousness, but about which lineages would carry forward specific covenant promises involving actual territory, actual nations, and actual historical responsibilities. It's a reminder that theological questions aren't always abstract. Sometimes they involve maps, borders, and the very practical question of who gets to live where. In a world still grappling with questions of national identity, territorial disputes, and the relationship between ancestry and destiny, these ancient texts continue to offer both insight and challenge to our modern assumptions about fairness, selection, and the mysterious ways that promises made millennia ago might still be shaping the world we inhabit today. If you would like further context and the rest of the story, check out previous videos and future videos. If you would like more information where to research this subject, pause this image and look into these resources or find resources in description. If you have book sources or links of your own on this subject, please share in comments or email me. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this forgotten biblical story. Leave a like, comment, share and subscribe. This is very helpful. Join me next time for another lost story of our biblical history. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe for more great content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.